Silence fell over the opulent dining room like a guillotine. A billionaire's terrifying patriarch, a man who crushed empires for sport, froze. All because a struggling waitress whispered a single obscure Italian word. What followed wasn't a mere conversation. It was the unraveling of a 30-year-old bloodline secret. Blood and money always carried the same metallic scent in rooms like this. L'Étoile was Manhattan's most unapologetically elitist private club, a sanctuary where multi-billion-dollar corporate executions were routinely orchestrated over plates of beluga caviar and perfectly seared wagyu. Beneath the cascading baccarat crystal chandeliers, fortunes were stolen, destinies were altered, and mercy was entirely non-existent. Maya Jennings knew the rules of L'Étoile better than anyone. Keep your eyes lowered. Keep your footsteps completely silent. Above all else, never under any circumstances make eye contact with the predators who paid for the privilege of dining in the VIP alcoves. Maya was 26, drowning in a mountain of medical debt, and desperately trying to keep her grandfather, Gabriel, in a specialized care facility. Gabriel's mind was fracturing, marooned in the distant memories of his youth in northern Italy, leaving Maya to shoulder the crushing weight of reality alone. She wore the immaculate black and white uniform of L'Étoile, like a suit of armor, masking her exhaustion behind a perfectly polite, impenetrable smile. Tonight, however, the air in the restaurant was thick with an entirely different breed of tension. The Valerius family had booked the grand alcove. Alexander Valerius, the 34-year-old billionaire CEO of Valerius Holdings, was a man of ruthless ambition. He was strikingly handsome, sharp-edged, and operated his logistics empire with the precision of a military general. But Alexander wasn't the reason the entire waitstaff of L'Étoile was sweating through their tailored uniforms. The terror radiating through the room was entirely directed at the man seated silently to Alexander's right, his father, Matteo Valerius. Matteo was a living ghost. 5 years ago, following a mysterious and heavily guarded family tragedy in Milan, the elder Valerius had simply stopped speaking. He didn't issue press releases, he didn't give interviews, and he absolutely never spoke in public. But his silence was not a surrender. It was a weapon. Matteo controlled the board of directors with nothing more than terrifying icy glares and razor-sharp gestures. A single scowl from Matteo Valerius had been known to send rival CEOs into premature retirement. He was a man carved from marble and malice, an untouchable patriarch who viewed the rest of humanity as utterly disposable. "I can't do it, Monsieur Laurent." A young waiter named Kevin hyperventilated in the kitchen, clutching a silver tray so tightly his knuckles were bone-white. He just looked at me. Matteo Valerius just looked right through me. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. I'm not going back out there. The maître de high-strung man who valued Michelin stars more than his own life pinched the bridge of his nose. "We are serving the most powerful family on the eastern seaboard, Kevin. You will march back out there and pour the Bordeaux, or you will be blacklisted from every restaurant in this city." Kevin untied his apron, tossed it onto the stainless steel counter, and walked out the back door without another word. Monsieur Laurent whirled around, his panicked eyes scanning the kitchen before landing squarely on Maya. "Maya, you're taking over table 1. Flawless service. No mistakes. Do you understand? If Matteo Valerius so much as frowns at his veal, we are all ruined." Maya swallowed hard, nodding once. She didn't have the luxury of walking out. Grandfather Gabriel's facility was demanding next month's tuition, and the tips from table 1 could secure his bed for another 6 weeks. She picked up the discarded silver tray, balanced the decanter of vintage 1982 Chateau Margaux, and pushed through the swinging mahogany doors into the lion's den. As she approached the grand alcove, the oppressive silence wrapped around her. Alexander Valerius was leaning forward, his jaw tight, intensely focused on the third man at the table, Benjamin Hayes. Hayes was a rival shipping magnate, a man notorious for his sleazy tactics and immense ego. Tonight was supposed to be a massive acquisition, a buyout that would solidify Valerius Holdings as an unstoppable global monopoly. But Hayes was playing games. "The offer is generous, Alexander," Hayes drawled aggressively, swirling the red wine in his glass. "But quite frankly, I don't know if I can trust the stability of Valerius Holdings. Not when the strings are clearly being pulled by a man who hasn't had the spine to speak a single word in half a decade." The temperature in the alcove seemed to plummet 20 degrees. Alexander's eyes flashed with a dangerous, lethal fury. "Choose your next words with extreme caution. Benjamin." Hayes smirked, emboldened by his own arrogance. He leaned back, locking his gaze on the silent, brooding patriarch. Matteo sat perfectly still. He was a striking man in his late 60s, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a charcoal bespoke suit that cost more than most cars. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but his dark, piercing eyes were fixed on Hayes with the intensity of a sniper. Maya stepped forward seamlessly, her movements practiced and fluid. She began to clear the appetizer plates, keeping her head bowed, striving to become completely invisible. "I'm just calling it like I see it," Hayes continued, his tone dripping with venomous condescension. "You want my fleet, Alexander. But everyone in the industry knows your father is a broken man. The great Matteo Valerius, hiding behind his silence, crippled by whatever pathetic guilt he dragged over from the old country. Why should I hand my legacy over to a coward?" Alexander slammed his fist onto the table, the crystal glasses rattling violently. "Get out! The deal is dead. Get out of my sight before I ruin you completely." "You can't ruin me, kid." Hayes laughed, standing up and adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Because you don't have the stomach for it. And your father, he's nothing but a hollow shell." Throughout the exchange, Maya stood perfectly still, clutching a silver serving tray to her chest. Her eyes involuntarily flicked down to Matteo Valerius. The billionaire patriarch had not moved an inch. His expression hadn't changed, but Maya saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Matteo's left hand, resting on his knee beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, was trembling. It wasn't a tremble of fear. It was a tremor of suppressed, blinding rage. And as Maya looked closer, she noticed the way his thumb was rhythmically, obsessively stroking the heavy gold signet ring on his index finger. The ring bore a very specific, deeply intricate crest, a falcon gripping a shattered crown. Maya's blood ran cold. The dining room, the crystal chandeliers, the angry shouting of Alexander Valerius, it all faded into a dull underwater hum. She knew that crest. She knew it intimately. For as long as Maya could remember, her grandfather, Gabriel, kept a small, tarnished silver box hidden beneath his bed. As his mind succumbed to the cruelty of dementia, he would pull the box out in the dead of night, his fragile hands trembling as he traced the etching on its lid, a falcon gripping a shattered crown. The ghost took everything Maya Gabriel would whisper, his eyes wide with a decades-old terror. He wears the falcon, but he is no nobleman. He plays the king, but he is a beggar of souls. A beggar. Remember that. Gabriel's rambling stories of a ruthless business partner in Milan who had betrayed their family, stripped them of their ancestral estate, and forced them to flee across the Atlantic with nothing but the clothes on their backs, had always seemed like disjointed fairy tales, the delusions of a dying mind, until this exact second. Maya stared at the ring on Matteo Valerius's finger, the heavy oppressive silence of the restaurant pressed against her eardrums. This wasn't just a billionaire. This was the ghost. This was the man who had destroyed her family's lineage, the phantom her grandfather still cried out for in his darkest, most confused hours. Hayes was still laughing, a cruel, echoing sound that grated against the high ceilings of L'Etoile. A silent king, Hayes mocked, turning his back on the table. What a complete joke. Alexander was motioning frantically for security, his face pale with a mixture of wrath and humiliation. Matteo just sat there, the great terrifying patriarch letting a lesser man insult him, insult his family, relying entirely on his son to fight his battles, while he hid behind his self-imposed vow of silence. Something inside Maya, a lifetime of struggling to pay rent, of watching her grandfather weep over faded photographs of bowing to men in expensive suits who treated her like furniture, finally snapped. The deferential, polite waitress vanished, replaced by a surge of inherited reckless Italian blood. She didn't move away. She didn't retreat to the kitchen like she was supposed to. Instead, Maya leaned over the table to collect Matteo's untouched crystal water glass. She brought her face dangerously close to the terrifying billionaire. She looked past the bespoke suit, past the cold, dead eyes, and saw the man her grandfather had described. Without thinking, without calculating the catastrophic risk to her job, her life, or her future, Maya looked directly into Matteo Valerius's eyes. "Mendicante," she whispered. The word was so soft it barely disturbed the air, but in the tense, breathless bubble of the grand alcove, it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "Beggar!" Matteo Valerius froze. The rhythmic stroking of his signet ring stopped instantly. His broad shoulders stiffened, going rigid as steel. For the first time in 5 years, the terrifying patriarch showed a genuine human emotion, absolute, unadulterated shock. Slowly, agonizingly, slowly, Matteo turned his head. His dark eyes locked onto Maya. The sheer intensity of his gaze was enough to bring a grown man to his knees. But Maya refused to look away. She stood tall, the silver tray gripped in her hands, her chin tilted up in quiet, fierce defiance. Alexander, noticing the bizarre interaction, paused. "What are you doing?" he snapped at Maya, his voice lashing out like a whip. "Get away from him. Security. Get this woman out of here right now." 2 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the alcove, moving swiftly toward Maya to drag her away. But then the impossible happened. Matteo Valerius raised a single hand. It was a small gesture, barely a few inches off the table, but it possessed such commanding, absolute authority that the security guards immediately stopped dead in their tracks. Alexander's mouth fell open, his anger replaced by profound confusion. Even Hayes, who had been halfway out of the alcove, turned around, sensing the sudden electrifying shift in the atmosphere. Matteo didn't look at his son. He didn't look at his security detail. His eyes remained anchored to Maya, analyzing her face, mapping the contours of her jaw, the specific shade of her hazel eyes. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. The surrounding tables had gone completely quiet, the elite patrons of L'Etoile, sensing that something entirely unprecedented was unfolding. Matteo leaned forward. The joints in his chair creaked. He opened his mouth, his jaw working, as if trying to remember how to operate muscles that had been dormant for half a decade. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, rough like sandpaper and heavy with the dust of the past. "Who taught you that word?" The sound of Matteo Valerius speaking aloud sent a shock wave through the room. Alexander gripped the edge of the table, his face draining of all color, staring at his father, as if he were witnessing a resurrection. A wine glass slipped from a nearby waiter's hand, shattering against the marble floor, but nobody so much as blinked. Maya held her ground, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She was terrified, but the memory of her grandfather's fragile, shaking hands fueled her courage. "A man who lost everything," Maya replied, her voice steady, refusing to break eye contact. "A man who remembers the falcon and the shattered crown. A man who knows that you are not a king, Mr. Valerius. You are just a ghost." Matteo's breath hitched. A profound, devastating recognition flashed across his weathered face. The cold, ruthless mask of the billionaire patriarch completely shattered, revealing a man haunted by ghosts of his own making. "Gabriel." Matteo whispered the name, carrying a lifetime of unspeakable guilt. Maya didn't confirm or deny it. She just stared at him. Alexander was practically hyperventilating. "Father, what is happening? Who is this?" Matteo slowly stood up from the table. He was a towering figure, but in that moment, the menacing aura that usually surrounded him was entirely absent. He looked right past his son, right past the dumbfounded Benjamin Hayes, and stepped closer to Maya. "Where is he?" Matteo demanded, his raspy voice trembling with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly like desperation. "Where is Gabriel?" "He's forgetting the world," Maya answered coldly. "Thanks to what you took from him in Milan, he can barely afford a roof over his head while his mind slips away. I have nothing more to say to you." Maya turned on her heel, the silver tray still in her hand, and began to walk away, fully expecting a security guard to tackle her to the floor. But no one moved. The entire restaurant watched in stunned, breathless silence as the untouchable Matteo Valerius, the man who crushed corporate empires for sport, stumbled forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward a 26-year-old waitress. "Wait," Matteo commanded, his voice cracking, ringing out across the silent dining room. "Please. I have spent 30 years looking for him." Maya stopped. She turned her head, looking back at the desperate billionaire. The power dynamic in the room had entirely flipped, pivoting on a single obscure Italian insult, spoken by a girl who was supposed to be invisible. The secrets buried beneath the Valerius Empire were about to be dragged into the unforgiving light, and Maya Jennings held the only key. Murmurs erupted across the dining room, shattering the elegant silence of L'Etoile. Waiters stood frozen, holding silver platters suspended in mid-air, while Manhattan's elite shamelessly stared. Matteo Valerius, the man who had terrified Wall Street for decades, stood trembling before a waitress in a stained apron. Alexander sprang from his leather booth, completely ignoring the smirking Benjamin Hayes. "Father, stop this," Alexander demanded, grasping Matteo's shoulder. "You are causing a scene. We need to leave. Now." Matteo violently shoved his son's hand away. He did not break eye contact with Maya. The sheer desperation in his dark, tear-filled eyes was entirely disarming. "Please," Matteo begged, his voice sounding like dry gravel tearing through a rusted pipe. "Take me to him. Name your price. Any price. Just take me to Gabriel." Maya's grip on the silver tray tightened until her knuckles ached. This man was the villain of her entire childhood. He was the monster who had stolen her grandfather's shipping company, Rossi Maritime, plunging their family into agonizing poverty. Yet standing before her was not a monster. It was a broken, aging man begging for a sliver of redemption. "He is at the Whispering Pines Care Facility," Maya said coldly, her voice echoing in the quiet room, "under the medical supervision of Dr. William Gallagher. But Gabriel doesn't want your money, Mr. Valerius. He wants his peace. You stole that from him in Milan." Matteo's chest heaved. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a sleek black phone. He dialed a number, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. "Bring the car," he rasped into the receiver. "We are going to Whispering Pines, immediately." 30 minutes later, Maya found herself sitting in the back of a sprawling, bulletproof Maybach. She had stripped off her apron, feeling entirely out of place against the butter-soft leather interior. Matteo sat opposite her, staring out the tinted windows at the passing city lights, his jaw clenched tight. Alexander sat beside his father, radiating a suffocating mixture of confusion and hostile suspicion. Care to explain why we are abandoning $1 billion acquisition to chase a waitress's delusional grandfather? Alexander finally snapped, adjusting his Rolex. Because Hayes is already calling our board of directors. He is telling them you have completely lost your mind. Benjamin Hayes is a fool, Matteo whispered, his voice gaining a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. And you, Alexander, are blind to the true cost of our empire. You think Valerius Holdings was built on genius. It was built on a sacrifice. A sacrifice I never had the courage to explain. Matteo turned to Maya, the streetlights casting long, haunting shadows across his face. Gabriel and I were not just business partners, Maya. We were brothers, half-brothers, born to the same father, a ruthless syndicate boss in Lombardy. When the Camorra, the Neapolitan mafia, placed a hit on our father, they came for his heirs. They came for Rossi Maritime. Maya's breath hitched. Grandfather always said you stole the company. He said you forged the documents and ran, leaving him to face the creditors. I didn't leave him to face creditors, Matteo said, a single tear escaping his eye. I left him to save his life. The mafia wanted the true heir dead. Gabriel was the legitimate son. I was the bastard, so I forged the documents. I transferred all the assets into my name, bearing the crest of the falcon and the shattered crown. I made myself the target. I took the company, and I drew the assassins away from Milan, fleeing to America. I wanted Gabriel to hate me. If he hated me, he would never come looking for me. He would stay hidden. He would stay alive. The heavy silence returned to the car, thick and suffocating. Maya's mind spun frantically. The stories her grandfather had told, the betrayal, the theft, the agonizing heartbreak, had all been a carefully orchestrated lie. Matteo hadn't destroyed Gabriel's life. He had completely destroyed his own reputation to ensure his brother survived. I searched for him, Matteo continued, his voice cracking, for 30 years. But Gabriel changed his surname. He erased his past. 5 years ago, I finally found a lead, a whisper of his location. But it was a trap set by old enemies. My wife, your aunt, was caught in the crossfire. Matteo looked down at his trembling hands. That was the day I stopped speaking. I swore I would never utter another word until I could apologize to the only family I had left. Alexander stared at his father, the hostility draining from his face, replaced by a profound, agonizing realization. The ruthless empire he had inherited was built on a foundation of brotherly love and unimaginable sacrifice. The Maybach pulled through the iron gates of Whispering Pines. It was a bleak, underfunded facility, a stark contrast to the towering glass skyscrapers of the Valerius Empire. Maya led the way through the linoleum-floored corridors, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They reached room 412. Dr. William Gallagher, a tired-looking physician with graying temples, stood by the door, holding a clipboard. He looked up in sheer astonishment as the billionaire patriarch and his security detail filled the narrow hallway. Maya, Dr. Gallagher asked, adjusting his glasses. What is going on here? Visiting hours ended 3 hours ago. Let them in, Dr. Gallagher. Maya insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Please. It's a matter of life and death. The room smelled of antiseptic and old paper. Gabriel sat in a faded armchair by the window, staring blankly at the dark parking lot. He looked incredibly frail, his skin like translucent parchment, his thin hands resting limply in his lap. He was trapped in the labyrinth of his own fading mind, miles away from the present moment. Matteo stepped into the room. The terrifying billionaire, the ruthless titan of industry, fell entirely away. He was just a younger brother, carrying the crushing weight of a 30-year absence. Slowly, Matteo knelt beside the armchair. The expensive fabric of his bespoke trousers pooled on the cheap linoleum floor. He reached out his shaking hands, gently grasping Gabriel's frail fingers. "Gabe," Matteo whispered. The nickname hung in the air, fragile and desperate. Gabriel didn't move. His cloudy eyes remained fixed on the window. Matteo swallowed a sob, sliding the heavy gold signet ring off his index finger, the falcon and the shattered crown. He pressed the cold metal into Gabriel's palm, closing the old man's fingers around it. "I brought it back." Matteo choked out tears openly streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I brought the crown back, brother. The debt is paid. The ghost is gone. You are safe now. Please, look at me." Gabriel's breath hitched. The touch of the heavy gold ring seemed to send an electric shock through his fragile nervous system. His head turned agonizingly slow. His cloudy eyes blinked, struggling to focus on the silver-haired man kneeling before him. A violent tremor shook Gabriel's body. The fog of dementia, thick and unrelenting, seemed to part for a miraculous, agonizing second. He looked at the ring in his hand, then down at Matteo's face. "Matteo!" Gabriel whispered, his voice barely a breath. You stole the ships. I stole the crosshairs." Matteo wept, pressing his forehead against Gabriel's trembling hands. "I took the target off your back. They were going to kill you, Gabe. I had to make them chase me. I am so sorry. I am so deeply sorry I couldn't tell you." Gabriel stared at the top of his brother's head, the decades of bitter resentment warring with the sudden, overwhelming rush of truth. Slowly, Gabriel's trembling hand lifted. He didn't strike his brother. He didn't shout. Instead, his frail fingers tangled softly into Matteo's silver hair. "You foolish boy." Gabriel rasped, a tear slipping down his own wrinkled cheek. "You foolish, brave boy." Maya covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Alexander stood in the doorway, completely paralyzed, watching his terrifying, untouchable father weep like a child in the arms of a forgotten old man. In that tiny, sterile room, the billionaire empire meant absolutely nothing. There was only blood forgiveness and the shattering of a 30-year curse. The very next morning, the corporate world awoke to an earthquake. Benjamin Hayes had called an emergency press conference, standing behind a podium with a smug, arrogant grin. He was fully prepared to announce the hostile takeover of Valerius Holdings, citing Matteo Valerius's mental collapse in the middle of a restaurant. Reporters from every major financial network crowded the room, cameras flashing furiously. "Valerius Holdings is rudderless," Hayes declared confidently into the microphones. "Matteo Valerius is a mute, broken man. Alexander is too green to hold the reins. It is time for a new era in global logistics." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the conference room violently burst open. The flashing cameras instantly pivoted. Benjamin Hayes's smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. Matteo Valerius strode down the center aisle. He was not trembling. He was not broken. The terrifying, ruthless patriarch had returned, radiating an aura of lethal power. Flanking him was his son Alexander, looking sharper and more dangerous than ever before. But it was the woman walking beside them that confused the press corps. Maya wore a sharply tailored designer suit, her head held high, looking every bit like a newly minted executive. Matteo reached the front row, his dark eyes locking onto the sweating Benjamin Hayes. "Mr. Hayes." Matteo's voice boomed through the conference room. It was deep, resonant, and entirely terrifying. The reporters gasped. The silent billionaire had finally spoken. "You have fundamentally misunderstood the situation." Hayes gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "Matteo, you're speaking." "I was silent by choice, Benjamin," Matteo said, stepping onto the stage, forcing Hayes to shrink back. "A vow made in grief, a vow broken by truth. Last night I reclaimed my family, which means I no longer have any distractions. I am fully focused on destroying you." Matteo turned to the sea of flashing cameras. "Valerius Holdings is not for sale. In fact, we are expanding. As of this morning, we have aggressively purchased 51% of Hayes Shipping's outstanding shares through offshore proxies. Benjamin Hayes is no longer a CEO. He is unemployed." The room erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters shouted desperately, trying to get a quote. Hayes stood frozen. His empire completely dissolved in less than 60 seconds. Matteo ignored the screaming press. He turned and walked back down the aisle, motioning for Maya and Alexander to follow. As they stepped into the private elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut behind them, Alexander looked at his father with a newfound, profound respect. "Brutal as always, father." Matteo offered a rare, genuine smile. "Family must be protected, Alexander, at all costs." He looked at Maya, his eyes softening. "Dr. Gallagher called. Your grandfather is being moved to the penthouse suite at Mount Sinai. Best neurologists in the world. And your office on the executive floor will be ready by Monday." Maya leaned against the glass wall of the elevator, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The medical debts were gone. The fear was gone. She had walked into L'Etoile as an invisible waitress, desperate for a tip. She was leaving as a formidable force, the undeniable heir to a legacy forged in sacrifice and sealed with a single courageous word. The ghost of the past had finally been laid to rest, and in its place, an unstoppable new empire had officially awakened. Did you see that twist coming, when money and power clash with buried family secrets? The truth always finds a way to the surface. If you were hooked by Maya's bravery and the shocking truth behind the Valerius Empire, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life dramas. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were Maya?